Let's now talk about social context and its role in determining the form and function of politeness. The choice of politeness formulation or various forms used for politeness may depend upon the social distance and the power relation between speakers who are involved in a kind of conversation. During that conversation, what politeness strategies do they employ would depend upon the relationship between them, and as well as the status. One might be powerful and other might be less powerful. And in such situations, there would be different politeness strategies that would be employed, or conversational strategies that would be employed by the speakers, and those strategies would decide about their use of polite or impolite forms. When there is a social distance, politeness is encoded, and there is always a more directness. If there is social distance between speakers, this distance may be of power, of status, of age, or any other thing. There would be more indirectness. And in such situations, we could assume where there is a more social distance, there is more indirectness. And where there would be less social distance, there would be more direct, bold, on-record statements. That means direct directives in such situations. There can be many variables that determine social distance, and among these variables, the important ones are those which are related to familiarity between the speakers or the relationship between speakers. We also have the differences of status, their social roles in which they are, or in the capacities in which they are participating in a certain conversation. For example, we might have a dialogue between a teacher and a student. So we assume that both have different social roles, and they assume different social powers in a certain conversation. And based on such assumptions, we do assume the expectations of politeness from both participants in a conversation. Age, gender, education, social class, occupation, professional occupation, and ethnicity. And in certain Asian societies, probably family background are also the various factors which decide about social distance. Degree of familiarity: if people know each other, they're quite familiar with each other, it is not necessary to use polite forms during conversation. Rather, if they use polite forms, despite being familiar with each other, it might convey other meanings than the politeness. For instance, I present an example from an English short story in which a wife asks her husband to hurry up for a certain task, and she uses very formal language to express negative politeness. And the word she used is, "Will you be kind enough to tell me what time it is?" And she goes on to say, "And if you will be kind enough to speed up a little." Do you think a wife asking this to her husband in such a situation would actually meant politeness? This looks like a kind of sarcasm, a criticism of her husband, because he's probably being late from somewhere where her wife wants him to go quickly. In such a situation, wife is trying to be extra polite, but in fact she is not. Her intended meanings are of sarcasm. So the use of such polite forms, when there is more familiarity between the speakers, it might mean something else than the politeness. We also need to understand that the differences in status, roles, age, gender, education can give speakers power and authority. In certain societies, for example, typical Asian societies, men would be considered more powerful in most of social situations where there is an interaction between them and their female counterparts. And especially without being gender biased, we can assume, especially in family matters in patriarchal societies like the one we have in Pakistan, we assume that men hold more power in family matters as compared to women in the same family. It is those of power of lower status, the less dominant ones, which would be more indirect and would use the strategies of negative politeness when addressing to the more powerful in their conversation. Whereas the people who hold more social power in terms of age, gender, social status, class, etc., they would be more direct or bald on record. Expressions which are more direct or bald on record are used by people who assume that they have got power. For instance, a lecturer addressing to his or her class and giving instructions to his or her students would use more bald on record or direct expressions instead of using indirect expressions or negative politeness strategies. He or she would be more direct and probably would render the directives in a more direct and assertive manners without bothering much about the social measures of politeness, because a lecturer in a classroom holds power over the students in traditional classrooms. We have an example from a video clip, and this example says a lecturer telling something, giving instructions to his or her classroom about a certain activity. And it goes like, now what we are going to do is a quick game of 20 questions. He or she is not asking about their choice of doing a certain activity. He or she straightway tells them what to do. They have got a choice of 20 questions, and they have no other choice. So he or she is being more assertive and more direct instead of being indirect or asking their choice in order to reduce any kind of imposition. Here there is no effort is being made to reduce imposition. Further, he or she goes on to say, you will get some points up here. Now these people can only answer yes or no, and you must ask yes and no questions. So you can't ask a question like what happened. I mean, there are clear and direct and imposing instructions here. But in a situation like a classroom where lecturer is powerful, such kind of utterances may be expected. And still, they may not be considered impolite, because in that social context, it is acceptable to most of the people involved in the situation.